exciting, and you can mention this to all your good friends. We have our book talks already scheduled all the way through March of next year, as you can see through the website. We also have scheduled our Michelle Smith lecture series as well, so keep your eyes peeled on the website for when those will be scheduled in the spring. It's going to be a very exciting year of talks. But now to the main event tonight. You guys are really in for a treat, because if you haven't seen Denver Brunsman perform, he's really quite powerful as a figure. But what he really is for Mount Vernon is he's an incredible advocate for Mount Vernon, because Denver is a tenured faculty member, associate professor at George Washington University, but he does many, many things for us in our education programs and our educational outreach. In fact, he just got back from Bentonville, Arkansas, where he led a George Washington Teachers Institute program at the Art Museum there at Crystal Bridges. And it was a fantastic event from everything I've heard. He does those sorts of things for us. He helps out with our Teachers Institutes. He teaches a class of George Washington University students out here in the library. Maybe you can ask him how you could audit that. I think starting next semester, you're going to do it again out here, called The World of George Washington. So he's a familiar face to those of us on the inside, and I'm delighted to be able to share his face with those of you on the outside as he talks about his book, his main book. Denver comes to us where he was the valedictorian at St. Olave's College. I haven't fact-checked that, but it says it on his CV. So we'll trust that he was the valedictorian of St. Olave's. It's a great college. And then he claims to have a master's with departmental distinction from Princeton. That's very important. His master's in history from Princeton and his PhD from Princeton University. No departmental distinction on your PhD, Denver. That's yeah, sure. It wasn't possible. Princeton University for many, many years has had probably the best history department in, well, they would say the world, in America. They really had a stellar group of people there. And Denver worked with John Murin, who is one of the kind of pillars of early American history and historiography of the 20th century. He's now retired, but he was quite a force, and for Denver to work with him was a great experience, I'm sure. So the book we're going to hear about tonight, before he came to GW, he taught at Wayne State University and some other places as well. The book we're going to hear about tonight, The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressment in the 18th-Century Atlantic World, won the Walker Cohen Memorial Prize from the University of Virginia Press. Outstanding work in 18th-century studies in the Americas and the Atlantic world. That's an incredibly prestigious prize in 18th-century studies. So we're delighted to see him here. And let's hear about this book. Everybody welcome Denver.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's rather frigid, and I'm always impressed at, Mount Vernon can throw any event on history and it gets people, even naval impressment, so I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful to Doug and Stephen McLeod and Michael Kane and everybody at the library staff for having me here tonight. They also hosted me as a fellow at Mount Vernon this fall. It was a wonderful experience. I had visited many times, and I knew how hard they worked, but being on the inside and seeing it from that perspective, it's really amazing how much work they put into the incredibly important mission of educating the public about George Washington. So thank you, Mount Vernon. Yeah, I'll clap for you. I also want to recognize a special guest I have here with me tonight. My nephew, Alex Nord, the tall gentleman standing right there, sitting right there, came all the way from California. He's a new professor at the University of California, Davis, in genetics and neuroscience and all kinds of stuff that is a lot smarter than I am. Hard to understand. He's the smart one in the family, but we're all very proud of him, and I'm glad he could be here. And I also want to thank my family, friends, former students who are watching via the live stream. I learned about that because one of my former students contacted me and said, I'm going to watch your lecture. And I wrote back and said, how are you going to do that? They were in Michigan, and they said, on the web. I was like, okay, great. So that's a really nice thing to have. So what I want to do tonight in talking about my book is to cover three main topics. And It's basically what the book is about. The first is how this institution of British naval impressment helped to ensure that the British had naval supremacy in the 18th century and had the strongest empire in the world at that time. I next want to talk about the impact of the practice on Britain's American colonies, and then wrap up finally in looking at how the practice of impressment influenced the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And so we'll get started just with some background on what impressment was. Impressment was a distinctive English form of involuntary labor, of forced service. It dated all the way to the Middle Ages, but it really exploded in the long 18th century, the period between 1688 and 1815, when Britain fought a series of wars against its archenemy, France, and often Spain, and they needed lots and lots of sailors to man their navy in those wars. You'll notice that historians rarely have a short century. It's always the long 18th century, the long 19th century. But that's the period that it happened in the period that I cover. In terms of how it worked, we don't have actual photographs, like we don't have actual images of press gangs at work, but we do have these helpful cartoons, these different prints that were made. And you can get something from these. And so this is a scene that takes place at Tower Hill, on Tower Hill in London. That was really the center of pressing, of impressment. In the 17th century, they actually kept sailors in the tower before they were ready for ships. By the 18th century, they were kept generally in prison ships until they were allocated to different warships. So in this scene, you see the gentleman with the blue coat standing there. That's a naval lieutenant. That would be someone who was in charge of the press gang. The gang would be a group of toughs, usually on land, usually sailors at sea. And they use these long clubs that you see, they're called cudgels, to force the men into service. They usually didn't use firearms or a sword or a cutlass because you wouldn't want to maim one of your prize recruits. So you can see it wasn't the most popular thing. You see the ship masts in the back there along the Thames, the ships waiting to take the men that were captured. So this practice seems rather outrageous to us today, to our sensibilities, but it was perfectly legal at the time. Impressment was a legal prerogative of the crown. Again, it descended from the Middle Ages, and there were just really three main qualifications to that legal status. Press gangs had to capture men who used the sea. That's the phrase that was used. Generally, sailors or people that knew how to sail. It could only take place in times of emergency, usually defined as wartime. And I use the title, The Evil Necessity, because they always use the word necessity, that it was a necessary thing that they had to do. Once a war ended, the men went free. And so that's the major difference with slavery and other perpetual forms of bondage. And the last rule is that it had to be British subjects. And we'll talk a little more about that because there were many mistakes made after the American Revolution when Americans were captured. But by law, the press gang had to capture British subjects. So it wasn't a very popular institution. There's a lot of critics of impressment in the 18th century. And you get these from some of these prints. And you see the title of this one, the rather sarcastic title, The Liberty of the Subject is what it's called. And you can see this is another scene in London. A whole community has turned out to oppose the press gang. Even the neighborhood dog is getting in on the action. And the gentleman that they're capturing in the middle of the picture, the man with the fancy yellow pants there, you can see a pair of scissors in his waist jacket. That indicates that he was probably a tailor and not a seaman. And this was a common criticism of impressment. And it was true that the press gang made mistakes. They did take men who didn't use the sea. But one argument that I make in the book is that they wanted sailors, and that was the main purpose of the institution. And the majority of the men captured were legitimate sailors. So in some ways, this distorted the actual purpose of the practice. Most men were impressed at sea from merchant ships. We're better to find sailors than at sea. Without getting too academic, I'll let you in a little bit on my thinking with this book and my argument and what other people had thought about. When I approached this subject, there were things written about impressment, But I think the question that historians were asking was how bad was it? And I always tell my students to approach a subject with a good question. And so they would ask, how bad was it? And then depending whether they were in Britain, they would say it wasn't very bad at all. Most American historians would say it was really bad. It was, something that was close to slavery. And so I wanted a new, fresh approach to this. And so the question that I came to with this subject was, if impressment was so bad, why was the British Royal Navy so good? And if you plan to buy the book and read it, you have to cover your ears now. This is a spoiler alert. I'm going to give you my answer to the question. My answer was that impressment was that bad. It was a real sacrifice for sailors. And the Royal Navy was that good. Even though these were disaffected, frustrated men that were captured, they performed very admirably for the British Royal Navy. And in fact, this institution helped the British to control the seas in the long 18th century. No sailors, no navy, no empire. That's my basic formula in explaining the practice. And so in total, impressment was the second most common form of forced labor in the 18th century British Empire. It's a distant second to slavery. I want to emphasize that it's distant, but it wasn't insignificant. In total, about 250,000 men were impressed during this period from 1688 to 1815. That's about half of all the men that served in the Navy. The other half were volunteers. We can never know precisely how many men were impressed because the Navy kept kind of sloppy records on that. And in some ways it didn't matter. As the British Admiral Philip Cavendish said in 1741, they're all volunteers once we find that they can't get away. And I always think there should be an R after that. And in the movie version of my book, there will be, for sure. So I want to look a little bit closer at these men that couldn't get away because they really turned out to be the heroes of my book and my research. This is a typical 74-gun warship. This is a detail of a print detailing the Battle of Havana in 1762, part of the 7 Years' War. And on a ship like this, there would be about 500 sailors, and they had different ratings. The lowest rating was landsmen. Those were landlubbers that couldn't sail at all. They were just doing a lot of manual work. The next rating was ordinary seamen. Those were sailors who were generally had been at sea for about 2 years. And then there was a category called able seamen. Those were the best sailors on the ships. And those are the men that you see, if you squint and you look at the masts, you see the ant-like figures climbing up the masts, and they're controlling the top sails of the ship. This took more than 2 years at sea to get these kinds of skills, to learn the ropes. That's a nautical term. And on any given warship, you would need at least a third of your crew to have these kinds of skills. And so that's who the press gang really wants, is that particular sailor. I'll give you a close-up to show. I said that they're the heroes of the book. The work that they did was amazing. If they were up on a yard like this, it usually meant that there was inclement weather. There was a reason to take in sail. And so they're more than 100 feet in the ground, and under the worst conditions possible. And the majority of them, the majority of the able seamen, were impressed because they could have made a lot more money on merchant ships, outside of the state system, outside of the Navy. Despite all of that, sailors had a bad reputation in the 18th century. They weren't always appreciated as much as I've tried to appreciate them in my book. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the man who wrote the dictionary in the 18th century, famously said, "No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. For being in a ship is being in a jail with a chance of being drowned. A man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company." And so there's a lot of truth in that quote, that sailing was hard work. But as I said, it was crucial for this whole British system of empire. These men made incredible sacrifices. And even though they did well once they were on board, in some ways they didn't have much choice. They weren't going to sink the ship and take everyone down with them. They did everything possible to avoid capture. And so I divide the forms of resistance in the book between nonviolent forms of resistance and violent forms. And And the nonviolent are particularly fun. Sailors found all kinds of ingenious ways to avoid capture by the press gang. And I think one of my favorites were a couple of sailors in London that opened up a fake law practice. They got a building and put up a sign so that the press gang wouldn't be suspicious, wouldn't come and get them. This is another thing that sailors did. They had other forms of disguises, and in this case, the sailors actually cross-dressing. And you can see the rather clever title to this print, Jack Detected Sailing Under False Colors. In this case, I think the sailor overdid it a bit. He looks kind of like a mummy in that print. So if running away, if using disguises didn't work, sailors would often engage in violent resistance, and that usually took the form of riots, community riots. We got a little taste of that with the print that was in London with the community and the dog. This is a scene from New York in the 1760s, and I chose New York for a reason. The place where impressment was the least popular was in the American colonies. And it's an interesting problem, because impressment actually happened less in the Americas than it did, say, in the British Isles. But because of that, when it did happen, these crowds would turn out and have particularly spirited forms of resistance. The colonies were very jealous of their liberties. They didn't want British naval officers coming into town and taking their men. And so impressment was actually the most common form of, impressment riots were the most common form of protest against British imperial rule before the American Revolution. If there was a riot in the American colonies, there was often a press gang close by. The largest riot was caused by this gentleman, Admiral Charles Knowles. He looks like such a nice guy. Charles Knowles came to Boston in November of 1747. And like many British Navy officers, he lost men in the American colonies. And the Navy officers referred to the 3 Ds, death, disease, and desertion. And desertion was a particular problem in the American colonies, because British sailors would much rather be in a Boston tavern than to be at sea. And so Knowles came in 1747. He lost about 50 men, and so he began to replacing them with Massachusetts sailors. And there was an unwritten rule in Massachusetts that you didn't impress Massachusetts men. If you were in Massachusetts, you took men from other places. And so this caused a riot in Boston. It lasted 3 days. It took over the whole town. The governor of Massachusetts, William Shirley, fled into one of the islands in Boston Harbor. And it only ended when Knowles turned all the cannons of his ships on the town, and he said, "By God, I'll now see if the king's government is not as good as a mob." That's another R. And finally, the crowd seeing this, calmed down. They had kidnapped some of Knowles's men, kind of a turnabout on impressment. They released them. And after the riot happened, everyone denounced it in Boston. And even though pretty much the whole town was involved, everyone denied being part of it. Everyone except the brewer patriot, Samuel Adams. At the time, Samuel Adams was 25 years old. He had just finished his master's project at Harvard, and you'll love this. The topic was when it was legitimate to resist government authority. Talk about education being relevant to someone's life. And so this event turned out to be a real live laboratory for Adams's training and what he had been reading about. And instead of denying that he was part of the riot, he defended it. And he defended it on the grounds that government authority had overstepped its bounds, both in impressing, but also in fleeing, in terms of the governor leaving and not protecting the people. So it had reduced the people to a state of nature, and in that condition, they were obligated to defend themselves, to defend their lives and their liberties. If that argument sounds familiar, well, it becomes very important in the American Revolution. And this is really the first time in the American colonies that this type of Lockean state of nature reasoning that was used. So impressment was very important, I think, in preparing the generation of patriots that came along in the 1760s and 1770s. It also is very important, indirectly, to Mount Vernon. Impressment is related to how Mount Vernon got its name. Admiral Edward Vernon was the commander of British forces during these wars in the 1740s. And he was the patron of Charles Knowles, and also the commander for Lawrence Washington, George Washington's half-brother. And so we can be grateful that Lawrence Washington had a good experience with this man, or else this estate would still be called the Little Hunting Creek Farm. Doesn't have the same ring to it as Mount Vernon. Vernon really personified the paradox of impressment for the British Empire in the 18th century. He personally opposed the practice and spoke, very movingly about how it denied sailors' liberties and how it's something that stained the British nation. Yet at the same time, he engaged in impressment, and in fact, he oversaw the whole practice in the Caribbean during these wars of the 1740s. At the time, he was the greatest celebrity in the Anglo-American world in the 18th century. He would later be matched and surpassed by people like the great evangelical minister George Whitefield, Benjamin Franklin, our own George Washington. But at this point, he was really, I'd argue, the most famous person of that half century. And he holds the record for being the person in whose honor more different medals were struck in the 18th century than anyone else. And when I was a fellow here at Mount Vernon, the staff was good enough to take me into the storage facility and show me some of the collections of the Vernon medals that they have. And this is an example of them. Vernon was closely associated with liberty. Again, that's ironic given his use of impressment. But he was associated with liberty for his efforts to dismantle the Spanish Empire in the New World. And he won a very important victory at Portobello in 1739, and that's modern-day Panama. And when he was an MP, he was a member of Parliament, and in Parliament he said, "I'll take Portobello with 6 ships." And sure enough, in 1739, he took Portobello with 6 ships. And that ends up being the backside of nearly all the coins that were struck in his honor. And so this particular coin, just to tell you the words, on the front side, it says, "The British Glory Revived by Admiral Vernon." And you can see he seems to be blowing or single-handedly trying to revive that British glory. And then the backside says, "He took Portobello with 6 ships only," 1739. And there's the 6 ships right there. And so Lawrence Washington, I think, couldn't help be impressed by Admiral Vernon. Oops, skipped over Lawrence. This is the portrait of Lawrence Washington that George Washington kept in his study, and that you will still find in his study today in the mansion. And so Lawrence Washington comes home from serving under Admiral Vernon, renames the estate. And a little bit about his experience, I think, is interesting. He wasn't himself a sailor. He wasn't impressed. He was actually a soldier, and he was a captain of the Virginia regiment that was going to join the British Navy and fight in these wars against the Spanish. But he ends up becoming a Marine, which is basically shipboard infantry. So he was a soldier at sea, and he served on Vernon's flagship, the HMS Princess Caroline. After Vernon won his initial victory, he had a lot of trouble. He lost most of his other battles in the war. He lost famously at Cartagena. Still, because of that first epic victory, it didn't diminish him or his fame. So Lawrence came home, and he not only renamed the farm, he tried to get his younger half-brother George into the Royal Navy. And this is the interesting connection that George Washington, as a young man, has to impressment. Lawrence arranged for the 14-year-old George to serve as a midshipman on a Royal Navy vessel that was anchored in Virginia. And by all accounts, George had his bags packed and he was ready to go. But his mother, Mary Washington, wasn't very happy about this plan. And she had written to her half-brother in England, a man named Joseph Ball, and this came up in the correspondence. And this is what Ball wrote back to Mary Washington when he heard the idea that George might go to sea in the Navy. He wrote, "I understand that you are advised and have some thoughts of putting your son George to sea. I think he'd be better as apprentice to a tinker. For a common sailor before the mast has by no means the common liberty of the subject. For they will press him from a ship where he has 50 shillings a month and use him like a Negro, or rather like a dog. And so that description was enough, probably along with other people talking to Mary, to convince her that this was a bad idea. And she kept George from going to sea. And so that's one of the great what-ifs of American history. And what if George Washington had joined the Royal Navy? And it's interesting in that description that Joseph Ball said that George would be at risk of impressment. That actually wasn't true. He would have been midshipman and petty officer. He wouldn't have been fair game for the press gang. But again, it shows the reputation of impressment was so strong that people feared it. So fortunately, Washington didn't join the Royal Navy. And because of that, we had the American Revolution. And I'm going to shift here and talk a little bit about the Revolution and the War of 1812 and how they were related to impressment. And this is something I cover rather briefly at the end of my book. The purpose of my book was really to explain how impressment helped to make the British Empire of the 18th century, but you can't leave out the Revolution and the War of 1812. But still, my publisher got the book, and they said, "This is great." And I got the war Doug mentioned. They said, "Now we want you to write another book about just this last part." So I'm impressed in this subject. I'm still working on it, and so maybe a few years from now, if Mount Vernon's good enough to me, I'll come back and I'll talk about that. But I'll give you a sneak preview right now of what I'm thinking about. The reason I think to have a second book is that everything changes. Everything changes in the American Revolution. And that sounds quite obvious, but in the academy, sometimes the obvious is overlooked. And some people actually claim the American Revolution doesn't change very much. But looking at this issue of impressment, it really shows how the relationship of individuals to the state changed very dramatically. American colonists and Americans went from being dependent subjects of a monarch to being free citizens of a republic. And this is something that Doug Bradburn has written very movingly and with great significance about. So I'm indebted to his work and other scholars. And they've shown that, American colonists, when they're British subjects, they're like any other British subject. They're born into this relationship with the crown in which they have to pledge their life to the monarch. It's something that they can't escape. There was a principle known as indefeasible or permanent allegiance. It basically meant once a king's subject, always a king's subject. And you had to serve in whatever way it might be. And for sailors, that turns out to be impressment. And so Americans created a much different relationship with the state, one that was much more consensual, that was defined in terms of rights and not authority. If subjecthood was an obligation, citizenship was really a choice. And so you begin to see that shift in the period before American independence. Americans went from arguing for privileges within the British system to opposing it altogether. And the figure that illustrates this process nicely is Benjamin Franklin. Between 1764 and 1775, for a rather long period, Franklin was in London, and he was working as an agent, in essence a lobbyist, for the colony of Pennsylvania. And it's interesting that he becomes Americanized while he's in London. And I think impressment is one reason why. In 1770, there was a massive mobilization for the Navy. Britain was getting ready for a possible war with Spain over the Falkland Islands. And I'm not making that up. Some things never change. And so there was a lot of information about impressment out in the streets. And Franklin got a legal decision, the most important legal decision, defending impressment. It was a decision from 1743. And he started writing in the margins of the decision and basically answering the judge back about why impressment shouldn't be legal. It should be illegal. And his genius was to see that if any government system would allow this practice, it really tainted the whole thing. And he said of the British Constitution that it is yet imperfect, since in so general a case it doth not secure liberty, but destroys it. And so you can see Franklin getting very worked up reading this pamphlet, because he writes more and more and more. And finally he decides that the only way to make this system fair is to do things like impress the judge that wrote the decision, impress other British politicians, and he says even impress the king. And Franklin wrote, "To say the truth, I'm not quite satisfied of the necessity or utility of that office in Great Britain, as I see many flourishing states in the world governed well and happily without it." And John Adams wrote in his autobiography that this was the moment in which Franklin turned against the king and the British system. Unfortunately, his comments were trapped on the margins of this legal decision in a London bookshelf until the 1780s, when they were finally published. And so the actual American revolutionaries in North America didn't have those comments until then. But it's very interesting. In my research, I discovered that George III was reading the exact same legal decision at the same time, in 1770 in London, because he was refreshing his own mind about why impressment was legal. We often think of George as an old man, but he too was young once and wearing many animals. I'd like to say that no animals were harmed in the making of this portrait, but I think that would be a lie. I think they were. And so George collected a lot of books. Just as Thomas Jefferson's library became the foundation for the Library of Congress, George III's library became the foundation for the British Library. And so I found his copy of this legal decision, and he also wrote notes about it, not in the margins, but on a separate piece of paper. And as you might imagine, they were completely different from Franklin's in style and substance. Where Franklin was creative and he was making things up in the margin, George was taking very rigorous notes, word for word, on the decision, the kind of notes that we tell students not to take because they're not thinking very creatively with the material. But he wrote, and basically quoting the legal decision, "I think the Crown, me, hath a right to command the service of mariners whenever the public safety calleth for it, the same right that it hath to require the personal service of every man able to bear arms in case of a sudden invasion or formidable insurrection. This personal service is a principal branch of the allegiance every subject owes to the Crown." So there is basically a synopsis of the indefeasible perpetual allegiance. And so eventually Britain and Spain avoided war, this time over the Falkland Islands. And so this particular crisis went away. But I kind of see the line being drawn and the principle, between citizenship and subjecthood being set. And it would continue to influence, I think, how both sides approach this issue through the Revolution and the War of 1812. Impressment shows up in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson and his committee members wrote, "He, being George III, has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands." And in this line and throughout the Declaration, you see Jefferson referring to the American people as our fellow citizens. And there's that word again, citizens. Except, we know, if you followed the news a couple of years ago, you might have heard the story about the draft of the Declaration of Independence that they had at the Library of Congress, and they used electronic imaging to really study it, and they noticed that in writing this, Jefferson slipped up. And instead of writing our fellow citizens, in one instance he wrote our fellow subjects when referring to the American people. And that's at the very bottom line there. And then you can see progressively, he did, I think, what all of us have done at one time or another. He tried to cover up his mistake. He had an eraser. The technology hasn't changed much from the 18th century. He erased, he got a pen, and he wrote over subjects and turned it into citizens. And he probably thought that he had gotten away with it, and he probably would have it if not for our 21st century technology. And so I use this story to try to lure students into becoming history majors that, it's just like CSI, basically. I mean, there's not too much difference. So the impressment continues to be a problem in the Revolution. And then after the Revolution, a lot of people predicted that that wouldn't be the end of it. And the reason that it wouldn't be the end of it is because if there was ever another war, all those American sailors at sea still looked a lot like British subjects, still talked a lot like them, and it would be hard for the British Navy to distinguish. There was a British Navy lieutenant in 1786, his name was John Mackenzie, and he said, if an impress takes place, how are the Americans to be distinguished by officers upon that service? Or rather, how are they to disprove the assertion of any man they are attempting to impress who declares himself to be an American? The familiarity being so great in their figure, complexion, language, manners, and habits as to render it impossible to distinguish the one from the other. And sure enough, America would continue to have this problem after independence of having its men impressed. By my estimate and the estimate of other scholars, about 10,000 American citizens were impressed during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the period between 1793 and 1815. And one thing I'm doing in my research is trying to refine that figure, because some claim it might be as low as 3,000, which is, I think, still a lot. Some very high estimates put it closer to 20,000, which I actually don't think is possible. But several thousand Americans were impressed. This is a problem that 4 presidents faced, beginning with George Washington. And ultimately, it helped to cause the War of 1812. Even though we're in the waning days of the bicentennial of the War of 1812, the last few years has been the big moment for the war that is always forgotten. I'm going to forget it tonight. I'm not going to go into great detail about the war, except to say it's a much more compelling event, I think, than people realize. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here. You're all here on a frigid night, Tuesday night, to hear about naval impressment. But this is a war in which America surrendered more territory than it ever has really in its history. Most of it, the Michigan territory, when William Hull surrendered in August of 1812. It's a war in which the U.S. Capitol was burned down in August of 1814. It's a war in which the treaty that ended the war didn't even address the things that caused the war, particularly impressment. And despite all of that, it's a war that Americans were convinced they won. And that's why you got to love this country. We're a country of optimists. And I think if you look really closely at it, I think the only people really to win the War of 1812 were Andrew Jackson and the Canadians. But I think there was something gained by the United States in just standing up to Britain, over this practice of impressment and other depredations that took place at sea. And so you see this confidence at the end of the war in images like this one titled, "We Owe Allegiance to No Crown." And it's a little bit hard to see, but that's a common sailor, and he's stomping on a crown, basically saying, we don't need the king, we don't need this practice of impressment. And I think in purely nationalistic terms, the American people weren't completely delusional. This crisis of impressment had caused them to affirm their own independence. It had forced them to define what it meant to be an American citizen, that it was a choice. It wasn't an obligation as it was in these other European nations. And the American people were deeply offended at being reduced once again to a condition like British subjecthood. It also turned out okay that the Treaty of Ghent, the treaty ending the war, didn't mention impressment, because people didn't know it at the time. But once Britain finally defeated Napoleon for the second time in 1815, impressment went away. It never happened again. And the main reason it didn't happen again is Britain didn't have many more wars in the 19th century. There was the Pax Britannica of the 18th century. And one thing I say in the book is that for impressment to go away, eventually the evil would have to outweigh the necessity. And that's exactly what happened. When the necessity wasn't there, it's something that the British stopped doing. Well, by the time that it ended in 1815, this institution, this practice, had a truly remarkable history. It had these humble origins, in the Middle Ages. It went from there to being one of the great paradoxes in the age of liberty, in the age of enlightenment. It helped to prop up the most powerful empire of its day, the British Empire, and it also helped to give birth to new notions of citizenship and nationalism in a future superpower. Thank you.
Okay.
This is great. We can do a song and dance routine up here.
Well, we're going to do a song. You've never been to one of these book talks. You don't understand what happens.
I'll never miss another one, I promise.
I think that works.
We can share this.
So, as the founding director, I always get to ask the first question.
It seems fair.
The thing about New Denver that annoys me so much about this book, it's
Yeah.
a great study of it, is that you want to have it a lot of different ways, it seems to me. It's evil, it's necessary, it allows Britain to have the great Navy, but it also is a major grievance that has a role in destroying their empire.
Sure.
I want to play a role that your advisor often would play. John Merriam is famous for playing a game of counterfactual. He has a famous essay, for instance, No Great Awakening, No Revolution, in which he plays with the notion if there wasn't a Great Awakening, would there have been a revolution?
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. If there wasn't a system of impressment in place, would there have been a revolution?
Yes. So, previous scholars have put a lot of emphasis on impressment and causing the revolution, and particularly politicizing sailors in places like Boston, which led to a lot of riots. One thing that I argue is that impressment is actually something American people defeat by the end of the 1760s. In other words, these riots were so successful that British press gangs won't come on shore by the 1770s. And so even though it's mentioned in the Declaration of Independence and the grievances, it's not one of the great causes. It might have been a bigger cause if those riots hadn't been so successful, if that makes sense. And this shows what a smart question that is. John Adams asked the same question. When the War of 1812 started, he wrote to friends asking, why isn't this the reason that we declared independence in the first place? And then, as John Adams did, he went on to answer the question by saying, well, because he had done all these other things, and it was because of John Adams. But
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The great answer. You let Loudon off the hook a little bit in his great press in New York.
Yeah.
And Loudon was a great enemy, I would say. Not enemy, annoyance of George Washington.
Yeah.
John Campbell, the Earl of Loudon.
Yeah.
So Loudon famously presses like 800 people in New York City. But then you read about how, well, he sent 400 of them back home. So it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
It strikes me that there's some alienation that happens from those moments, even if they defeat impressment, an alienation from the notion of a friendly system of governance.
Yeah.
That has a staying power.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And any system. So to just talk about this one incident, it's representative because the British had almost like a catch and release approach. Catch and ask questions later. They would take as many men as possible. So in the meantime, even if those 400 men weren't kept on the ships, they don't have a very good impression of the British system of government after that experience. So I agree, absolutely, yeah.
All right, so let's open it up to the gallery. Yes, sir, I saw you first.
Yes, just two quick questions.
Yeah.
One is, notwithstanding the legality of impressment seen in the late 1600s and 1700s, was there a limitation on the number of times that an individual could actually be impressed once, say, war number one is terminated? Was that individual just the subject to being impressed again?
Yeah, excellent question. So I find men that are impressed multiple times, sometimes in the same war, because even though one condition of impressment that you were supposed to serve to the end of the war, a certain number escape, they desert, and cross-dress or whatever it might be to avoid getting captured again. But they're captured multiple times. And that was considered one of the problems with the system, just from a point of view of efficiency. It was inefficient. Yeah.
And the second part is this. Given America's reaction to impressment of seamen, do you find it surprising at all that for so many decades thereafter, we had a conscription of soldiers in this country without questions being asked about the obligation, obviously not taking them with the threat of being clubbed, but nonetheless taking them for mandatory military service. I'm having trouble connecting the dots on that. A country that was so opposed to impressment seamen, but was more than willing to say, you're coming in to become a foot soldier.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So during the Revolution, there was an ideal of volunteerism. Right? They were George Washington and other leaders of the Continental Army were going to operate a different way, and they did. The British Army actually impressed as well, men, not as much as the British Navy. And so what I find interesting is the Continental Army in the American Revolutionary War is really small. But a lot of those men had come of age through the British system, all of them, really. And so they impress men on certain occasions, and it always leads to an uproar, like it did when the British did it. And so I think it's interesting that by the War of 1812, it's truly a nearly all volunteer Army and Navy. And so that was the ideal. And you're right, that during other wars, beginning with the Civil War, and that's been lost over time. But that's, I think we've actually, with our all-volunteer Army now, I think we've come back to that ideal of a republic that was so important at the founding. It's a great question.
Right here.
Were there instances of impressment by revolutionary independent American people?
Yeah, so there were, and again, the revolution is interesting because if you think about world history and the revolutions that we see on the news today, they're often caused by nationalism. They might be caused by a group that wants to have its own country. And what's interesting about the American Revolution is that nationalism is something of a product of the Revolution. It doesn't necessarily exist before. The nationalism they had was actually British, and they thought of themselves as so British they were mad about this system. And so it takes a while for them to shed those British practices. And that's what I see with these Navy commanders that do it. Again, it's on a small scale, especially compared to how the British did.
Literally trained British Navy.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes, I mean, they were in desperate conditions, and they needed men.
Yeah. They did in Virginia, in the Virginia Navy, they impressed men.
They did.
All the time.
Yeah, the state navies.
Yes, ma'am, over there.
Yeah.
I always thought that the impressment, by and large, by the British, or even maybe the French, took place at sea with the privateers, or maybe what we call merchant marines, or merchant ships. However, the impressment that happened during the Revolution, those men were often held in these abysmal prison ships off of New York, many of which were, diseased, died, and if they escaped and were recaptured, they were often killed.
Yeah, absolutely. So during the Revolutionary War, you're absolutely right. When the British Navy would capture American sailors, they would give them an option, whether to serve in the Navy or be imprisoned. And in these prison ships, they had horrific conditions. Somewhere between 15 to 18,000 men died just in the New York prison ships. And it's a mark of the American patriotism that the men didn't give in and serve. And there's a lot of legalities involved with that, and one reason they were so bad. But one is that those men were technically not prisoners of war in the eyes of the British state, because that would have been recognizing the legitimacy of the United States as a country. So they were treated as traitors, as men in rebellion. And so they were in limbo legally, and that was one reason for such terrible treatment. Yeah.
Denver, in your study, how is your working on the American Revolution and the War of 1812 evolved your own thinking about this first book in terms of the broader trajectory of the story? I mean, are you basically finding what you thought you'd find, or are some of the conclusions a little different than what you thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you get a lot of historians together in a room and they start talking about the research or the books that are written, it's very common to hear, oh, if I could just do that again, or if I could, I mean, most of them don't want to do it again, but I have a strange chance to do it again, right? I can, I guess I still agree with my arguments that I made in this book. I agree with my decision not to go on and have a book this fat that covered everything, because like I said, I think the world really does change with the American Revolution, and this new designation of citizen and citizenship is a very powerful weapon argument against the British way of doing things.
Mary, right here. And then,
were they paid?
They were paid, and that's another important difference with slavery. They had wages. They were.
Was it as much as the volunteers?
So one reason the system worked is that impressed men and volunteers are treated basically the same once they get on the ships. And the one difference is that a volunteer could generally choose their own captain, which could be very important in the 18th century. But the impressed men were often the better sailors. So they advanced actually faster in many cases than the volunteers did. So they're paid. They're not paid as much as they could have made if they were serving on private ships. Because during times of war, the times of scarcity, smuggling, the prices for everything went up, including labor. And so they could have made much more on the private ship. So that's the economic sacrifice that they make in being impressed.
right here.
I congratulate this gentleman for asking my first question and the madam for asking.
Excellent.
Hi, Denver.
Hey.
I found the images that you brought to us, the different prints, to be really compelling, ways of representing the sense of outrage
Yeah.
against the impressment as a process, as an assertion of authority. And the most compelling one is the one that you chose for the cover of your book. That detail about this tailor, though, stands out
Yeah.
in my mind. And I'm also wondering if part of the sense of outrage about the impressment was about the comment that they made, taking in people who had a skill in another area. Is that part of the outrage that people are expressing as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, those are all good points, and thank you for that comment. I had the cover of the book figured out years before I had the book. I didn't know if I'd get done writing this thing, but I knew if I did, what would be on the cover. And no, that's absolutely part of the outrage. And as Doug said, I'm something of a relativist. I have I have it all ways. And one of the arguments by historians before I wrote this book is that this is a real problem. That lots and lots of landlubbers are impressed. And through my researches, I make a little bit of a different argument. I say it's not that many, but I think you're right. When it happens, it has a profound effect. The vast majority were sailors, and in some ways they were marginalized figures, like that quote that I read to you by Samuel Johnson. And so I think that was one way that the Navy got away with this, is that they were poor, they were at sea. It was something of a hidden practice. You didn't see it that often, but when you did, things like this would happen. So.
Well, in Denver, I think that to criticize the law, to criticize the King's law, in a sense, they're criticizing an abuse of impressment.
Yeah.
That this is not supposed to be how it
That's
works.
right. That's
they're
right.
not
Yeah.
actually criticizing impressment per se.
No, that's right.
But that's a lot what you see in the
Yeah.
18th century. Is
Yeah.
they criticize the abuses
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
actual system rather than
Yeah.
the system. And so
Yeah.
historians, I think, what you nicely show is that there wasn't this great, overwhelming dislike of the system when it functioned under the law.
Yeah.
It was the moments where the major abuses happened that you get the resistance. And so people, is resistance revolutionary or is it conservative? Right? When people are resisting so that things are done the way they've always been
The
done,
right way, yeah.
that's a little different than saying we're resisting this to create a whole new system of governance. And that's one of the important differences that come out of the way the 18th century world, and that's what Denver does.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
no, that's right, and that's and that's why I find that Franklin marginalia so interesting.
Yeah.
Is that that's the first moment that I see where somebody isn't arguing for just a privilege within the system,
Right.
that Massachusetts should be exempted, but you can impress everyone else. He's saying no, the whole system is rotten.
Yeah, it's great. Yes, sir, right there, and then in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk. One of the first things you mentioned was with the people trying to avoid being impressed was the cross-dressing.
Yeah.
And it's a motif I've seen in seafaring songs of the period.
Sure, yeah.
These were published in a collection in the late 19th century, but a lot of songs were 100 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And you see that so often, and I just find it really interesting that
Yeah.
there's a possible origin of that motif.
Yeah.
Because you see it's,
Absolutely.
recur. Now, I wonder, question.
Yeah.
Pose this as a question. What kind of source material did you find? I'm talking about folk songs after the fact.
Yeah.
Diaries,
Yeah.
personal journals of people who were trying to escape or avoid impressment.
Yeah, the answer is yes. All the things you said. Historians of early American history have to be somewhat greedy in our sources because we don't have that many, and especially when you're writing about common people, many of whom were illiterate and didn't leave sources. And so I make a lot of use of the ballads that you speak of. You find lots of rich material in those. And then you have to, there's state records, naval records, that you have to read between the lines. There was actually surveillance of sailors in London. They were paid informants to, tell the Navy when a sailor was around. And so those are very interesting records, and you can kind of get a sense of their lives from those. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir, right there.
I was looking over the introduction of the book, and you mentioned the term impressment widows.
Yes.
And I was wondering for the widows whose husbands eventually did return, how were they received when they came back? Did their families generally take them back in, or was there some tension there, or did they have to basically go off and make a new life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I try to write as much as I can about the families of impressed seamen and the wives, and as you say, I use this term impressment widow to talk about the women left behind, because they never knew if or when their husbands would come back. And I designated my wife Taryn the chief impressment widow for putting up with me during the during the writing of the book. There are some really interesting circumstances that I found, kind of like happened in early modern France, the famous story of the return of Martin Guerre that you might be familiar with. There's also stories from the Civil War of this happening, and I have a few cases where the man comes back and the woman has remarried, and that creates an awkward situation. So this disrupted family life, it disrupted communities, and it's fascinating on just a human scale to see the experience that people went through.
Well, graphically pictured, the women are the ones that are fighting.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right.
Fighting the women. I mean, he has his smoke raised at the woman.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at that, graphically pictures that.
No, that's right. It makes the argument for me. Right? Yeah.
Yes, right over there.
What role did the Royal Marines play?
Okay, so the Marines are an interesting group. Technically, they weren't impressed, and they didn't necessarily have to impress men because they had enough volunteers. And so one reason that they have Marines on board the naval ships is of course, like I said before, seaboard infantry in case they get in a fight and they need them. But they were also the guards, in a sense, and they're part of the discipline system and making sure that the sailors don't desert. And the British, they do amazingly well with this forced labor force, system. The desertion rate's only about 7%, and that sounds kind of high, but the French and Spanish, it's 15-20% in any given war. And they're not, they're conscripts in that system, but not quite as violent. And part of that's the Marines, part of that's the discipline system, and part of that's the leadership in the Royal Navy. That once they get on these ships, there's quite good leadership for the time, and men are socialized into the system until they begin to fight, for one another, if not always for king and country.
Well, Denver, this has been fantastic. As you see, the more Denver talks, the more he's going to become an apologist for questions.
Give me the hook.
Before everybody gets him a round of applause, I want to present him with his fellows prize.
Oh my goodness.
This is something that we present to our fellows, and we very much appreciate everything you contribute to Mount Vernon. This has been a fantastic. There are books for Sarah right outside the door, and Denver will be right up here signing books, so please go ahead and get one. And you have to promise to come back when you write the next volume of the study.
And thank you all. You live in a lovely, lovely audience.
Everybody online too?
Yes.